At first glance, Sean Combs looked like the kind of man modern celebrity culture was built to obey. He did not just enter a room, he seemed to define the room. For decades, his image was constructed out of power, polish, control, and the kind of wealth that makes other people look smaller just by standing nearby. He was not sold to the public as fragile, mysterious, or morally complicated. He was sold as untouchable. That is why the fall hit so hard. In September 2024, federal agents arrested him in Manhattan based on a sealed indictment. Less than a year later, in July 2025, a jury cleared him of the most serious charges, including racketeering, conspiracy, and sex trafficking, but still found him guilty on 2 prostitution-related transportation counts. Then in October 2025, the sentence came 50 months in prison. The shock is not only in the legal timeline, the shock is in the image collision. A man who spent years performing absolute command was suddenly trapped inside a system where command belonged to someone else. Prosecutors, judges, jurors, evidence, procedure. The old Diddy image had always implied that he could shape the story before anyone else even understood what story was being told. But a courtroom does not care about aura. It does not care how large your name used to feel in culture. It reduces power to a far colder language: counts, charges, rulings, sentencing. And that is where the first fracture appears in this story. Not just that Sean Combs was accused, not just that he was convicted on lesser charges after escaping the worst ones, but that the public suddenly had to see him in a frame where the old mythology of invincibility no longer worked. That is what makes this more than a celebrity crime story. This is the collapse of a very specific fantasy, the fantasy of a man who had spent so long embodying power that people forgot power can be forced to sit still. The most revealing thing about Sean Combs is that his public image was never merely successful. It was imperial. He looked like the kind of person who could absorb scandal, outlast enemies, and stay standing simply by refusing to look shaken. That illusion survived for years because it had been fed by money, fame, proximity to greatness, and the larger-than-life theater of American entertainment itself. But once the legal case moved from rumor to arrest, and from arrest to verdict, the terms changed. He was no longer being looked at as the man who ran the party. He was being looked at as the man who could no longer control what happened after the doors closed. And that is the hook at the center of this story. What happens when someone who built his entire image around dominance is finally trapped in a narrative where dominance means nothing? The answer is not just humiliation. It is something darker. It is exposure. Because the moment a man like Sean Combs stops looking untouchable, the public does not merely see weakness. It starts rereading the entire myth backward, asking whether the image was ever power at all, or just performance scaled so large that everyone else mistook it for truth. Long before Sean Combs became the man who looked as if he owned every room he entered, he was learning how rooms worked from the inside. He was born in Harlem in 1969, attended Howard University for a time, and began his career not as an artist standing at the center of attention, but as an intern inside the machinery of the industry. That matters because Diddy did not first rise through vulnerability, eccentric genius, or the mythology of the misunderstood star. He rose through observation, speed, appetite, and a very specific instinct for where power actually lived. He worked at Uptown Records, first as an intern and later in artist development, helping shape acts like Jodeci and Mary J. Blige under the guidance of Andre Harrell. In other words, before he became a symbol, he became useful. He learned how taste could be turned into influence, how energy could be turned into leverage, and how the person behind the artist could sometimes hold more real authority than the person in front of the microphone. That is the seed of the entire story. Sean Combs was never built like someone who wanted merely to be famous. He was built like someone who wanted to control the temperature of the culture itself. Even in those early years, the qualities that would later make him look imperial were already there. The hunger, the polish, the refusal to stay small inside somebody else's system. His public image would later make that ambition look glamorous. But at the beginning, it was something much colder and more practical. A young man studying where the levers were and figuring out how to pull them before anyone else did. The break that changed everything came in 1993, when he was fired from Uptown and responded not by disappearing, but by building his own kingdom almost immediately. He founded Bad Boy Records that same year and brought the notorious B.I.G. with him, setting in motion one of the most consequential power shifts in 1990s hip-hop. The label's earliest run, Craig Mack, Biggie, Faith Evans, Total 112, was not just commercially successful. It trained the public to associate Sean Combs with something larger than taste. He began to look like a maker of stars, a man who could turn charisma into an empire and turn sound into status. That is what makes this phase so important in the larger arc. Before people feared the collapse of the Diddy image, they first had to believe in the Diddy machine. And the machine was dazzling because it mixed ruthless business instinct with spectacle. Bad Boy was not sold as modest artistry. It was sold as dominance, luxury, and motion. It taught the audience to see Sean Combs not as one talented figure among many, but as a force around whom other careers could orbit. The darker irony, of course, is that empire building always contains the blueprint of its own later exposure. A man who learns to define himself through reach, influence, and command can look invincible for a very long time, especially if the public keeps mistaking control for character. But that is exactly why the fall would later feel so large. Sean Combs did not rise as a fragile celebrity who unexpectedly broke. He rose as someone who made power itself look like a personal style, and once the public believes that style is real, it stops asking what it costs to build it.
The empire only became truly dangerous once Sean Combs stopped looking like a sharp executive behind the curtain and started looking like the main character of the entire spectacle. That shift came with No Way Out in 1997. It was not just a successful debut album. It was the moment Sean Combs fused music, grief, glamour, and dominance into a single public identity that the culture could instantly recognize. Industry histories note that the album produced multiple major hits, including Can't Nobody Hold Me Down, I'll Be Missing You, and It's All About the Benjamins, while I'll Be Missing You famously debuted at #1 on the Hot 100, and the album later won the Grammy for Best Rap Album. What matters more than the trophies is the emotional effect. Sean Combs was no longer just the man who could discover and shape stars. He had become a star large enough to absorb mourning, luxury, fashion, celebrity, and industry power into one image. He did not merely appear successful. He appeared inevitable. That is the crucial transformation. The public stopped seeing him as a talented builder of careers and began seeing him as a force that could turn everything around him — sound, style, grief, status, nightlife, money — into proof of his own scale. Once that happens, success is no longer just measured in charts. It becomes a myth. And Sean Combs' myth was built on size. Bigger parties, bigger entrances, bigger ambition, bigger influence, bigger reach. The image he sold was not simply, I made it. It was, I define what making it looks like. That myth only got heavier once it moved beyond music and turned into a full lifestyle empire. Sean Combs launched Sean John in 1998, and over time the brand became one more layer of the same public fantasy. He was not just making records, he was selling aspiration itself. Biographical summaries describe him as a rapper, producer, entrepreneur, and fashion figure, and that combination is exactly what made his image feel so unshakable for so long. He was not confined to one lane, which meant the public could project power onto him from every direction at once. Hip-hop, business, fashion, television, wealth. Later coverage of his pre-trial empire even described him as one of hip-hop's wealthiest figures, with a reach stretching across labels, clothing, media, and branding. The important thing for this story is not every individual venture. It is the way all those ventures worked together to harden a single illusion. Sean Combs did not simply participate in the culture, he sat above it. That is why this stage of his life has to be written as more than career growth. It is the period when success became architecture. The audience learned to look at him like a man who could build systems, move people through them, and still remain standing at the center looking untouched. And once the public has spent long enough believing in that kind of untouchability, the later legal collapse does not feel like an ordinary downfall. It feels like the collapse of an entire worldview. Before the courtroom, before the verdicts, before the sentence, there was first this version of Sean Combs, the man who had turned dominance into a lifestyle and made the world mistake that lifestyle for permanence. What makes Sean Combs's downfall feel so much heavier than ordinary scandal is that the legal outcome did not simply punish a man. It forced a myth to stop moving. For years, his image had depended on motion. Parties, deals, red carpets, private jets, hit records, entrances big enough to feel like declarations of ownership. Then the frame changed. After his September 2024 arrest, the story moved into a place where image could no longer run ahead of consequence. By July 2025, the jury had acquitted him of the most severe counts, including racketeering conspiracy and sex trafficking, but still found him guilty on 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. Then, in October 2025, the sentence came down, 50 months in federal prison. Those facts matter not just because they are serious, but because of what they do to the old Diddy image. The public had spent decades looking at him as a man who could absorb pressure and still remain above the room. But a courtroom strips power down to a colder language. Charges, counts, verdicts, sentencing. No amount of luxury can soften that vocabulary. And that is where the public fantasy finally cracked. He was no longer the mogul who seemed able to bend culture around himself. He was a defendant whose life was being reduced to legal findings and prison time. The old image of control did not vanish because people suddenly stopped recognizing his fame. It vanished because fame stopped being the relevant currency. Once a man like Sean Combs is forced into a system where the room does not belong to him anymore, the audience has to confront something it never wanted to believe, that what looked like permanence may have been scale, not safety. That is why the ending of this story should not be written like a simple fall from grace headline. It is stranger than that. Sean Combs did not collapse in one clean motion. He was acquitted on the charges that would have defined him as a far darker kind of criminal in the public imagination, yet still convicted on charges serious enough to leave him imprisoned and appealing his sentence into 2026. In April 2026, judges on a federal appeals panel openly questioned whether the roughly 4-year and 2-month sentence had been too harsh, while his lawyers argued that the judge had improperly leaned on evidence tied to conduct for which he had been acquitted. That lingering appeal matters because it leaves the story in an unstable place. Not a total legal exoneration, not a total moral restoration, and not the complete annihilation that the most severe counts would have produced. Instead, what remains is something more corrosive, a permanent rewriting of what his image means. He can no longer be seen only as the architect of luxury, swagger, and cultural command. Every old symbol of power now carries a second shadow behind it. The arrest, the verdict, the sentence, the prison term, the appeal. And that is the deepest damage. The Diddy myth was built on the idea that power could protect itself by becoming larger than ordinary rules. The end of the story suggests the opposite. The larger the myth grows, the more catastrophic it feels when the world finally proves it can still be made to sit still. Sean Combs does not leave this story as a simple villain or a restored king. He leaves it as a man whose public image can never again exist without the outline of the courtroom burned into it.